Good evening. The undead necromancer mayor of Chantedfins, Zasit Azothdumat, has been leading our fortress for well over a decade. Her necromantic powers, once a source of suspicion among our dwarves, have been a boon to our settlement, and she has long since earned the trust of her people. Zasit has brought us piety, wealth, stability, and martial might through her great wisdom. But Zasit roamed the folded continents for many hundreds of years, long before her arrival to Chantedfins. Her tale is one of war, temptation, and betrayal. Tonight, we recount the legends of Zasit Azothdumat and reveal the long, storied history of our undead necromancer mayor. Near 400 years ago, in the year 199, Zasit began working as a beast hunter at the tender age of 12. She wandered the Brass Hill, a warm, temperate shrubland north of the mountain home. Zasit hunted small game, opossums, wombats, rabbits, king snakes, the sorts of creatures a young hunter would be able to safely take down. But it wasn't long before the war caught up with her. The war. The war that has been waged since near the advent of civilization itself, and still rages on to this day. The 5-century-long conflict known as the Crazy War. For what madness could drive people to kill each other for so many generations? The Crazy War is a conflict between the dwarves of the Whiskered Tool and the necromancers of the Labors of Liberty. In the year 200, Zasit was called to fight on behalf of the Whiskered Tool. She was deployed in a great battle in the Shady Hill, some leagues to the south of her hunting grounds. The battle, which came to be known as the Clash of Horns among the dwarves, was an awesome sight. An alliance between the dwarves of the Whiskered Tool and the humans of the Empire of Standards helped the forces of the living assemble a great army. Near 2,000 dwarves and humans charged into battle against the undead. They fought alongside their war dogs, elephants, grizzly bears, giant rats, giant grasshoppers, giant snails. It was a bizarre and incredible sight. The Labors of Liberty fielded a few hundred humans, dwarves, and goblins, some mercenaries, some undead, along with their strange necromancer experiments, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of the Alliance. Zasit, young as she was, didn't end up killing anyone in that battle. Presumably, they had enough troops that fielding 13-year-olds on the front lines was unnecessary. She soon returned to the wilds to continue hunting, but after a close call with a giant dingo, Zasit decided there were better ways to make a living than braving the wilderness. In 203, she settled in the dwarven fortress of Sneak Shields, the capital city of the Whiskered Tool. There, she was appointed Baron at the age of 16. What bloodline claim she might have had to that title is anyone's guess. Dwarven nobility lineages tend to be rather difficult to follow. She nonetheless spent those years in power and luxury. In the year 207, she was given an artifact steel crossbow, Twisted Bride, as an offering. Soon after, she became a bride herself, entering into her first marriage in 209 with a dwarf named A-Tier Sprinkled Arc. For 17 years after being appointed Baron, Zasit lived a pampered life. However, in 220, the war once again came for Zasit. She was called upon to fight against the Labors of Liberty, and spent several years fighting the undead. She was eventually deployed at the infamous fortress of Workglaze. That fortress has changed hands many times throughout the years. The place was constantly being conquered by the necromancers, then reconquered by the dwarves or our human allies. Of course, these days the goblins control the fortress, but that's another story. Zasit helped retake the fortress from the necromancers in the year 224. However, her time at Workglaze affected her. Zasit has always been very curious, often to her own detriment, and this place piqued her curiosity. Since the fortress had been conquered by necromancers so many times, the culture of Workglaze was rather unusual. Many of the civilians living there had embraced necromancy and death worship after living under the necromancers for so long. Entire races created by necromantic experimentation lived there as regular citizens. Zasit gained a new perspective on her enemy, and started to come to respect their values, sympathize with their goals. In 231, Zasit began worshipping Tig the Lustful, dwarven goddess of death and disease. She became obsessed with her own mortality, and sought to extend her life by any means. In Zasit's quest to gain the secrets of life and death, she journeyed to the Tomb of Hounds, the resting place of the previous ruler of the Empire of Standards. Rumor had it that this human queen had been resurrected as a mummy. Perhaps this creature held the knowledge that she sought. But all Zasit found in the tomb was a bizarre and grim artifact. Purge Phantom, the Honest Tumor, an artifact dwarf bone box. She took this dark treasure from the tomb, perhaps hoping that studying it might give her some new insights into life and death. When it became clear that she would learn nothing from this box, she just handed it off to a passing mercenary. Zasit's new obsessions created a rift in her marriage, and she divorced her husband in the year 244. They had been married for 35 years, and Zasit was now 57. With no idea how to extend her life, Zasit floated around for decades. She was married a number of times, always divorcing a few years later. In 270, she joined the Ashen Cult, a religion dedicated to the worship of Tig the Lustful, though her goal of immortality wasn't any closer. Zasit continued fighting in many battles against the Necromancers over the decades, though she curiously never killed any of their forces. Did some sympathies to the Necromancers stay her hand? None can say for sure. By the year 316, Zasit was nearly 130 years old. She was coming upon the end of her life, and was beginning to grow desperate. In just a few decades, she would be gone from this world forever. It was then that Zasit was again called upon to fight at the Fortress of Workglaze, to once again retake it from the Necromancers. Unbeknownst to Zasit, the Necromancers were plotting to bring her into the fold on that very day. Einod Colored Pages, the leader of the Labors of Liberty, had begun to infiltrate the dwarven nobility and recruit barons to her side. During that battle, Einod's agents made contact with Shorast Shet Bethbim, another baron who was fighting for the Whiskered Tool. Shorast soon defected to the Labors of Liberty, and was granted the secrets of life and death as a result. Einod Color Pages personally took in Shorast as an apprentice. That summer, Shorast convinced Zasit to join the Labors of Liberty. He took her in as an apprentice, and granted her the secrets of life and death. Finally, Zasit's desire for immortality had been fulfilled. In 216, Zasit settled in Lobsterquake, the Necromancer Tower. A strange but fascinating place. There was so much to learn here about the nature of life and death, about the boundless power that Tig the Lustful could grant. For 14 years, she learned all that she could. She observed the experiments of her colleagues, and combed through the fascinating tomes in the Lobsterquake library. Zasit had exactly what she wanted. For a time. But eventually, Zasit was given new orders by the head necromancer. In 330, Einod Colored Pages instructed her to return to Workglaze. The Necromancers had once again conquered the fortress, and Zasit was to be granted the honor of overseeing the city. She would be chiefess of a great fortress, and her old stomping grounds at that. Shorast was to join her as well, to watch over his apprentice in her new role. Zasit accepted readily, trusting in the judgment of their leader. Her trust was misplaced. The Labors of Liberty had no chance of holding Workglaze. The combined forces of the humans and the dwarves were great, numbering in the thousands, and had only grown over the past century. Every time the Labors of Liberty took over the fortress, the Alliance quickly reconquered the site with their overwhelming numbers. After a one-sided battle, the humans of the Empire of Standards took Shorast and Zasit into custody. Shorast was made a slave, while Zasit was locked up in prison, out in the human hamlet of Farm Davald. This was Zasit's lowest point. She and her master had been betrayed by that fool Einod Colored Pages. The head necromancer had sent them back to the fortress on an impossible mission to defend an undefendable site against an unstoppable army. He treated them like he treats all his thralls, as meat, to be thrown at his enemies with no regard for their safety. While in prison, Zasit received word that Master Shorast had been killed. Not by the humans, but by the Labors of Liberty. Einod had sent an attack out against one of the human sites, and Shorast was killed in the ensuing battle. The heartless lich had killed his own apprentice due to his incompetence. For years, Zasit brooded in her cell over her great misfortune. But, in time, Zasit began to look again to her god. In prison, she met other believers, and joined another sect of Tig the Lustful, the Putrid Doctrines. She worshipped with great fervor for decades, and after 34 years in prison, in the late spring of 364, she was anointed as a priest. She was now Zasit Azothdumat, Sacred Filth. and on the day of her ascension to priesthood, she escaped the prison. She had been bribing the captain of the guard, promising to grant him immortality in exchange for leniency. Once he had served his purpose, she made her escape without ever following through on those promises. She settled in the nearby hamlet of Grand Bridges. This site was also owned by the Empire of Standards, but perhaps she would be able to lie low here. Zasit worked as a priest there for some time, promoting the faith and teaching the ways of Tig the Lustful. But while her faith may have helped Zasit endure prison and achieve freedom, being a priest was both a blessing and a curse. After 9 years, the adherents of the putrid doctrines in Grand Bridges were persecuted by the humans. Their sacred sites were desecrated, and Zasit was forced to flee from Grand Bridges in 373. And thus was Zasit's life for well over a century. She would find a settlement, usually in the Whiskered Tool, live among their people for some decades, and eventually be ousted from the community when they realized she wasn't aging. Zasit once again began fighting in wars against the Necromancer towers. It's not that she regretted becoming a Necromancer. Zasit has an insatiable curiosity, and greatly values the knowledge the Necromancers gave to her. This isn't even about revenge. Zasit doesn't tend to hold on to grievances. But after seeing so much fighting and incompetence from the Necromancer towers, after watching them kill their own and lock themselves in war for centuries, it's clear this couldn't go on. Zasit values a harmonious existence and sees competition as wasteful and silly. Dozens of Necromancer towers vying for control over the continent, unending warfare and a constant stalemate, that's chaos. Something has to be done. Something has to change. There has to be a better way. The crazy war must be brought to an end, one way or another. But there was little Zasit could do besides working as a foot soldier. She was always chased out of communities before gaining much power. She lived many lives across the centuries, but what she really wanted was to rule the world and bring about a new age of harmony under her undying dominion. In 521, she found a new husband, one who might be able to spend eternity with her, Dishmablek, another necromancer. And in the early summer of 550, after much wandering and warring, Zasit Azothdumat and Dishmablek made their way to Chantedfins. Here they found a fortress in need of leadership, a place where they could study necromancy without fear of persecution, a place where they could safely raise a family, and perhaps a place where Zasit could consolidate power and work towards her greater ambitions. Many sacrifices were made. Zasit lost her husband in an experiment gone wrong, and lost a part of herself when she had to be reanimated. But our mayor gained something far more important. For today is the day of her coronation. True, some other ruler sits on the throne in the mountain home out north, but true power lies here, in Chantedfins. The power of knowledge, the power of life and death, the power to forge great wasting armies and mighty undead beasts, in accordance with the will of Tig the Lustful. By consent of the faith, Zasit has been crowned Mage Queen of Chantedfins. It is her holy mandate to unite the warring Necromancer tribes and bring them under her banner. No longer will the Necromancers hide their secrets from each other, slowing the spread of knowledge. In order to unlock the secrets of the universe, all scholars and sorcerers must work together in harmony, in one united necromantic empire, and the dwarves of Chantedfins will not rest until that harmony has been achieved. But it's getting late, and I must retire. Come find me again some other night, and hear more tales from the great empire of Chantedfins.